All right. So good morning, Jeannie. Welcome.
Morning.
So before we officially get started, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, how you got into gaming and with USC Games?
Great. I'm Jeannie. I currently work for USC Games as the office manager / administrative budget assistant. But before starting work with USC Games, and still while I work at USC Games, I'm also a professional tabletop role play gamer, as well as a designer and tabletop role play supplement writer. Um, I got my background and start in games when I was in college, played my very first game of D&D with some friends, and then took a long break from any tabletop role-playing games until about 5 years ago. And that is when I started playing Dungeons and Dragons again. And from there, kind of branched out into a bunch of different games and had the opportunity to come to Los Angeles and be part of some professional streams. And ever since then, I have been doing all of this basically professionally. It's been a lot of fun.
That's really cool. Thank you for that. So today we're here to talk about Black History Month. And for you personally, what does that mean?
So I think Black History Month is an interesting thing, not just as like a concept, but also as a placeholder in like the history of America specifically. Because, and I think that all like Black people have like a complicated set of feelings around this month, because it's like, yes, there's a month that celebrates us and our history, but we also live in a country where that history isn't really being taught properly. And there are a lot of people who don't really know like the full like scope of Black history in America. Black people built America from, from nothing, quote unquote, but there wasn't nothing before we got here. Natives lived on this land. They had been cultivating it. They had been caretakers and stewards of this land before, the colonists showed up and brought along, African slaves. And so like the history and like the general understanding of this month, I think is really complicated. Like, I think it's great that, we have a month that we are allowed to kind of step up and shine. But I'm also the person who believes like, Black history is American history, and we should celebrate Black people and especially Black creatives all year round because they've contributed so much to American society.
Absolutely. So it's great that you mentioned that, because I think we, as people, would play different roles, and we have, different sets of identities. And as a game designer, but as a Black game designer, how do you think these two identities and roles intersect? And, tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, as a Black person, I feel like a heightened sense of responsibility to make sure that, actually, I'm going to wait for this plane to pass over, and then I'll answer this question. I live close to an airport, and
You sound
apparently,
fine.
yeah, apparently it's loud to me, but I don't know how much the mic is picking
Oh,
up.
I
So I'm
see.
just gonna wait for a second until it's okay. As a Black person and as a Black game designer, I definitely feel like a heightened sense of responsibility to make sure that I am making a space that feels and is inclusive, because it's kind of an unfortunate aspect of games that for the longest time it's been a boys club. It's specifically been a white boys club, and we've seen a lot of things come out of that, like Gamergate, Comicsgate, like all of this sort of stuff that like lives in the nerd society that's like, in some ways like very latently white supremacist, and like doesn't want to make space for women or for queer people or for people of color, like trying to find a place within the gaming community that is inclusive of us. especially since we've been around since the beginning, and it wasn't like we weren't here to start with. It's just sort of this kind of denial that like the history of games, has always been one where everybody has like a stake in it. Like games are a universal language. Everybody speaks the language of games. And so that by like necessity requires inclusivity. So as a Black game designer, I always move into that space with the idea that this is a place where everybody is going to feel like they belong. I'm going to make sure that whatever I'm designing feels like a space where everyone can bring their ideas, their identities, their unique points of view to the table and feel included. And by the same token, it's always like, it's really unfortunate that Black people are the ones that have to sort of step up, not just Black people, but any person of any identity other than a white cis male has to kind of step up and be like, if I want to make sure that I feel represented at the table and that I am, that I feel included, I'm the one that has to get in there and actually make the change, because I can't expect other people to do it for me. And to a certain extent, that is always going to be true. It's like, if you want something done right, do it yourself kind of mentality. But at the same time, just like, it would just be nice if people kind of defaulted to making sure that their games felt like something that everybody could play, as opposed to like, this is only for me and I only care if I feel included. It's like, no, when you're creating a game, you should it is good to create for yourself, but create for yourself in a way that like other people can come in and feel invited to your space, and feel like they have something to contribute to it.
Right. So the relatability of the game and the inclusivity, which we've started to see a lot more, I think, in the gaming space, as we have more. Essentially, we have trained and cultivated more talent in the space, which brings me to my next question. That now in this academic world, where you get to interact with educators, you get to interact with students. Tell us a little bit more about Black excellence in the video gaming space. How do you see it has changed over time, and what do you hope to see in the future?
I think especially USC Games has made like a really concentrated effort to uplift and highlight Black game designers, especially up and coming and really eager Black game designers. We have a lot of people who are trans in our program, of all races. And I think that when it comes down to it, it's like, we as educators have an opportunity to create a platform, create a springboard off of which, Black creatives can leap. And it is especially in, relevant right now, since USC Games like just recently started developing the Lawson Fund to give like financial opportunities to people who might not necessarily have those chances to start out with. Because I think what it comes down to is like, we cannot just give space to the privileged few who may not necessarily need as much help to attend a school like USC Games. We have the opportunity to like broaden the scope of our student body, like to make it like, inclusivity starts with education. Like, I was an educator for 13 years. I had the opportunity to teach children. And I know that like the best type of education is the type of education that can be accessible to as many people as possible, because everybody learns differently, everybody creates differently, everybody expresses themselves differently. And I think that our program especially, and other programs around the country are doing a really great job of creating spaces that like feel accessible. accessibility, I think, is the number one and most important part of like creating games. And what I think is so interesting about the young Black creatives in our program specifically is that all of them, I think, are very conscious of that. Like they care a lot about the fact that they want to feel included in games. And so they're also working to create spaces that are inclusive of others.
Excellent. To our last question, because I do want to keep it kind of short for different videos coming out this month with our students and faculty members. So this is a fun one. Who is a Black hero that comes to mind from a game or a real life that really inspired you throughout your career or your life?
So interestingly enough, not yes and no in a game, because I'm fairly certain you can you absolutely can find him in a game. I was inspired from a very young age by Geordi LaForge from Star Trek: The Next Generation. He was the ship's engineer. He was a Black man who was disabled. He was blind, and he wore an assistive device in order to help him see. You can find him now in the MMO Star Trek Online. If you ever play that, he's a character in that as well. And he's played by the incomparable LeVar Burton, who has also been a lifelong hero of mine. If you know Reading Rainbow, if you know LeVar Burton Reads, his podcast. We're not sponsored by LeVar Burton, and I've never had the chance to meet him, but he is very legitimately one of my heroes. I think if I ever met him in real life, I would probably cry. But there was something about the way that he, as an engineer, he was a very creative engineer. He was somebody who was always coming up with, out of the box solutions for problems. He was supportive of his friends. Like his very best friend was an android. So like he himself, as a Black engineer in the space, made room for somebody else in the space that was different and unconventional. And like he, in my opinion, is like such a great example of like Black excellence in like, especially STEM, which, games fits into sort of as like part of the STEM program, especially with our CS Games students who are the other half of the USC Games program. And yeah, I've always deeply admired him. I've always admired like how hard he works and how much of his own heart he puts into everything that he does. Lifelong inspiration. Geordi LaForge from Star Trek. So another great Black engineer from Star Trek Voyager, B'Elanna Torres, who, like me, was biracial and was the very first Klingon engineer in Starfleet. So there are a lot of really great, there's a lot of great Black excellence and geekery, especially in Star Trek, that like I've grown to admire throughout my life.
That's really funny because first of all, I think that really echoes with the career trajectory that you have chosen and you've become.
I think that's very true, especially the things that I am currently considering as like next steps for me in my career in the future. It's like, yep, I think I'm very much well on the path to that kind of stuff. But yeah, like space is awesome. I love space.
and Star Trek is a wonderful piece because so Professor Henry Jenkins, who's the founder of essentially fandom studies, he was inspired because that was the only show as he was growing up that had diversity in it, which goes to show how important representation is when we're creating video games or content and whatnot. We have that kind of responsibility to make sure that that this goes out and it reaches all kinds of people, so that we need to make sure that everybody is essentially invited to this world that we're creating.
I think Star Trek is such a great template for people to go off of, because even when Star Trek failed, like there was always the attempt to try. Like they always tried. Like even if they didn't do a very good job of it sometimes, like you could see that the effort was there and that they were making the attempt, even if they didn't make it very like a very good one. So like, and I think that's the other thing is like Star Trek always gave itself room to make mistakes. And they like, yeah, Star Trek is great. If you need really great inspiration for how to like be inclusive in games, Star Trek is such a great example of it. So
yeah, for sure, absolutely. So thank you so much for your time today, Gini,
thank you.
and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, I will see you very soon. Thank you so much for having me.